Greetings from Tokyo, I'm Trip, and welcome to the Hammer of Wrath. This week, you and I are going to paint an Imperial Guard Combat Patrol. Let's go. Thanks for joining me in the studio. This week, we continue our monthly Combat Patrol Challenge, and in fact, this month's video marks our penultimate or second to final Combat Patrol of the year. It's crazy to think that I've done 11 of these. But before we look at the Combat Patrol, I want to take a brief second to talk about a very unique experience in Tokyo. Once a year, in mid-December, in the southwestern suburb of central Tokyo called Setagaya, there is a festival called the Boroichi. Now, it's not a festival in the most traditional sense of the word here in Japan, but there are food vendors and some musical entertainment. What it's really about is closing down the streets and having one of Tokyo's largest flea markets. Now, as you saw in the intro, I had the opportunity to attend this last December, and yes, I do actually plan the videos that far ahead. And while I was there, catching up with a friend from out of town, I had the chance to shop for some antiques and unique home decor items, as well as enjoy Choco Banana. If you were a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that my absolute favorite festival food is Choco Banana, and of course, I took the opportunity to have one, or two, or three. While I was there, I did find some really great items for my home, and you can also find tons of kitsch items, including older pieces of art and dolls. Well, that's enough about my flea market finds. Let's talk about the Astra Militarum Combat Patrol. Now, I have collected and painted a full 2,000-point Imperial Guard army years ago. It includes several tanks and a flyer, as well as over 30 guardsmen with custom metal heads. Of course, with the release of the new and updated sculpts, I couldn't pass up the chance to update the army, so let me show you how I built and painted an Astra Militarum Combat Patrol. There is a lot to put together in this kit, so we're going to get our tools ready: single-sided nippers, an X-Acto blade, and some plastic glue. Now, unlike some of the newer Space Marine kits, there's a lot of customization available in this, and the sprues are incredibly tightly packed. So we'll go ahead and use our single-sided nippers, clip out our parts, and start assembling our infantry. They go together really easily. Now, I want to do something special for this, so I went out to Cults 3D and found these really great trench warfare bases by Station Forge. They were only $3, so I grabbed those and printed a plate full, and then using some super glue, I just mounted them onto the 25 and 28 millimeter bases. Because the models are plastic and the bases are resin, in order to attach the models to them, we need to use super glue again. And once that's all set, we begin the priming process. Like most of my models, I begin with an airbrush coat of Vallejo polyurethane primer in black. Getting an airbrush to primer models is sort of like a cheat code, and you can see how quickly you can do an entire army. Now, once that black primer is dry, we're going to go ahead and do a zenithal prime with white primer from Vallejo. And what this does is just help us understand the shapes of the models. You can see here, just a quick top-down spray, and we've already established some shadows and highlights on the model. Now, because the major color of the uniforms is a khaki, I'm going to go ahead and spray khaki on all of the models, and then do another top-down zenithal of a much lighter pale sand color in order to create additional volumes. And once that's dry, I'm going to go ahead and brush paint on an olive drab green on all of the armor plates. In this case, I'm using Vallejo Cayman green, but any sort of military or olive drab green will work just fine here. This is where we want to start exercising some brush control. We don't want to get any of the green paint on the khaki that we've already established, so just be careful as you work your way around the model. Once the armor plates are complete, I'm going to go ahead and paint all the leather straps, harnesses, and other pouches and things like that. Here, I'm using Vallejo Beastie Brown, and I'll just work my way around the model, completing all of the leather elements, including the spats over the boots. With those colors laid in, there are only a few more details to take care of. I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Gray on the boots, and then I'll paint silver on the belt buckle, any gun parts, and in this case, the teeth along his chainsword. Here I'm just painting the face and the hands on the model using Cadian flesh tone. I painted about half the models as Caucasian and half is darker skin tone to make some visual variety in the army. And once that was done, I used the airbrush to apply some burnt umber by Vallejo along the base. Because these are trenches, we want them to be muddy, and if we get a little overspray on the feet, that's fine. We want these guys to look like they're tromping around in the mud. Once we have all the base colors down on the model, we're going to go ahead and apply a coat of gloss varnish. And this is important to the next step. We're going to create an oil wash. Here I've just got some inexpensive Braun oil paint, some mineral spirits, and in a small container I mix them into a very thin wash. Now it's important to use completely separate brushes here. You can't use the same brushes as you would for your acrylic paints. And as we brush this on, we see here that because of the gloss varnish, it runs right into all the recesses and creates this great level of detail. You let it dry for about a half an hour, 45 minutes, and then using a makeup sponge, you brush the high points on the model like the shoulder pads of the helmet. You get this really great effect. Moving on to the command squad, the models went together just as easily as the basic infantry, and you get a lot of really great options for your HQ units. Again, we're just going to do that prime, then a zenithal, then lay in our khakis, and then another layer on top of that to bring out an additional highlight. And then we'll work our way around the model, applying the Cayman green or any other olive drab green you might have along all of the armor panels and things like the helmet. And in the case of the sergeant here, he also has a power fist. And because this is the command squad, instead of using silver on the things like belt buckles and ornamentation, I'm going to use some Gehenna's gold here to sort of set them apart. We'll hit them with a gloss varnish, and just like the base infantry, we'll go ahead and apply the oil wash to them. The trick here is to make sure it doesn't pool up in any one place, so you can see I'm moving it around with the brush. And again, after about 45 minutes, you just want to wipe off the excess oil wash using these disposable makeup sponges. We're going to pay a little extra attention to our HQ unit, and here I'm just going back in with that Vallejo burnt umber, and I'm going to put some mud splashes along the bottom of her greatcoat. We want these models to look like they've been fighting in the muck for months and months on end without reprieve. So we'll just work that along the bottom, use some water to blend that in and make it look like mud has accumulated there. I kept the flag separate for ease of painting. If I had glued it to the model, there were a few places that would have been nearly impossible to reach, so I'll just go ahead and work my colors into this. Here I'm using Vallejo Bloody Red and Charcoal Gray, and once those two colors are dry, we'll go ahead and clean up the design of the flag and all the raised elements using Games Workshop Corax White. This is a white that actually gives pretty decent coverage in a single coat, so using a 000 brush, I just go through and very carefully hit all the raised edges to bring out the details. The final step to finishing the flag and all of our infantry is to apply a wash of Agrax Earthshade and Lamian Medium in a 1-to-1 mix over the entire surface. Moving on to what turned out to be my favorite part of the Combat Patrol are the Field Ordinance batteries. This is a new unit that's been added in 10th edition. I had a lot of fun putting these together and they look really great. The bases on these are huge, and so it's an opportunity for some really fun storytelling. We want to continue our theme of endless trench warfare, so let's add some additional elements to the bases. I went to Cults 3D and found this. It's this really great set of additional scenic elements made specifically for the Field Ordnance batteries, and it's absolutely free. So I brought them into my 3D program, went ahead and stacked up the ammo rounds, and the STL pack even includes these spent shell casings, so I made some clusters of those, set them in my 3D printing program, and about an hour and a half later I had these really great additional elements. Now we have to plan out how the base is going to go before we glue anything down, so I'll set everything down, I start moving my pieces around, making sure that everything that I want to be on the base is going to fit. Now again, we do have a lot of room to play with here, and the idea I had was this gun has been firing for weeks, so all around it are the spent shell casings, sort of reminiscent of those photos you see from World War I, where there are literal mountains of empty shells that have been fired. Once we mark everything off with a white colored pencil, we'll go ahead and start super gluing down our elements. Now we're not going to glue down everything. In this case, we're going to glue down the sandbags, the boards, and some of the spent shell casings, but we want to keep everything separate. I've even glued the crew onto temporary 25mm bases. Because we don't have 3D printed bases large enough for these, we're going to use a combination of Sterling mud and Tamiya soil effect in order to create our muddy trench surface. Now, I wouldn't advise using just the Games Workshop texture paste here, as it's $10 a bottle and you're going to need so much, you'd basically go broke using this stuff. So you'll notice that mine's a little bit like crunchy peanut butter. That's because I've added additional sand to it. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the Tamiya paste. It's really great. It just sort of goes on thick like peanut butter. We want to spread this around generously, and if it gets a little messy near the edges, we just clean it with a damp tissue. Once that's dry, we have to prime everything. That's going to start unifying our colors. It doesn't matter how many different texture paints we use. It's all going to look the same under a prime. So we'll go ahead and work our black prime on that. And then, of course, the artillery pieces, which we've kept separate. You'll notice that I've also put some of the texture around the tires in order to make it look like they've been rolled into place in the mud. And then we'll prime our infantry the same as we did when we were doing the squads. And then, of course, we'll do a white zenith all along the top of everything. Now, again, we do this because it's going to make the layers that we paint after brighter along the top and add additional volume to the shapes. And in the case of the terrain here on the base, I'm just going to do some random patterns with my zenithal because we want some subtle variation in the color of the mud. Once the primer is dry, we'll go ahead and apply our Cayman green using the airbrush. Because the majority of these models are that dark olive drab green, we're just going to use the airbrush to lay that in quickly. And while we've got our airbrush out, we'll change colors and use the burnt umber from Vallejo to cover all of our mud here. Again, a little overspray is fine. It's going to look like mud and dirt, and that'll all be covered by the oil wash later on anyway. Next, I'll use lead belcher from Games Workshop on any of the metallic parts, and then I'll paint the tires using Vallejo charcoal gray. Really great coverage, and it has this sort of like a light rubber color to it. Then I'll go through and paint all the rounds using a copper on the shells. Here, there's no reason to be tidy. A lot of this is going to be covered with an oil wash later on, and that sort of covers a lot of sins. And speaking of the oil wash, of course, we've got to coat everything in that gloss primer to make sure that it flows evenly over the surface and goes into the recesses. Here you can see I'm applying it to the base. I'm just going to sort of put this randomly in some areas to make them darker than others. We want the soil to have some variance in it. And then I'll put that on the crates and other things. And when we move back to the artillery pieces, it just flows, as you can see, really well. I just dunk the brush in, put it on, and it just slides right into the recesses. Later on, if it's gotten in places we don't want, we can just wipe it off. I don't do a lot of detail work, but I allowed myself to paint the targeting screen there. And once these are all set, we're going to go ahead and use Revell Contact to Pro. Makes a really great seal between plastic parts. We'll set that artillery piece in, and next we'll be putting in all the crew. We snap those off the temporary bases that we super glued them on and apply some plastic glue. Now remember, we've marked the spots here where these guys are going to go, so we're getting a really good plastic on plastic bond here because the texture paint is not in the way. We'll put the gunner in place, and we should be all set. The last thing we'll need to do is, of course, hit it with a matte coat in order to knock down the gloss that we put on. That's going to unify everything, make it look more realistic. The final piece of the Combat Patrol is the Armored Sentinel. This is actually a new version of the kit. I've never built a Sentinel before, one of the old ones, so I'm excited to put this together. I am a absolute sucker for building a mech of any kind. If you look through the history of my channel, I build dreadnoughts and ghost keels and Invictor warsuits. I love all of them. Here I'm using some clamps from the dollar store. These are actually really helpful when you're building vehicles or anything that has a cockpit. It'll hold those parts together and make sure that the seal is tight and there's no gaps. So I'm just going to continue building the rest of the body. I had intended to magnetize this main weapon mount here, but as it turns out, it actually friction fits really well. As you can see, it goes on there very tight, and with a little effort, you can pop it off to use something else in higher point games. Here, I've decided not to use the antennas. I always snap those off. You'll see later on that I put like a backpack and some supplies there. And this was one of the only mold lines that was really egregious, so I went ahead and used some sprue goo to fill that and then sanded it smooth. I'm going to use Revell Contact to Pro to connect the two pieces because I know that'll make an inseparable bond, and then I'll move on to priming the model. Again, we're going to use that Vallejo polyurethane black and then zenithal white over top so we can help define our shapes and create our shadows. This is especially important on vehicles, otherwise they just end up looking really flat. When the primer's dry, we'll start applying our base coats. Again, we'll use the airbrush to put in our Cayman green, and then I'll work my way around the model using lead belcher to finish all the metallic details like the chainsaw and these handles. Once the base colors are laid in, of course, we're going to apply the gloss varnish to help the oil wash find the recesses. But before we apply the oil wash, we'll put these decals on. I actually have a separate tutorial on my channel on how to apply decals so that they look like they're painted on. Check the link in the corner there. I'm sure that'll help you out. Now, in this case, I've mixed the wash with a little extra mineral spirits to make it much thinner than usual so that it flows off of the panels and goes only into the recesses. On infantry, I keep it a bit thicker, but here we make sure that it's thin so it goes more evenly into the recesses. There's not a whole lot to it. I just work my way around the model, making sure I cover everything. Now to finish the plasma, I'm actually following a tutorial by Juan Hidalgo, but I'm doing like the low rent, low effort version of it. If you want to see how to make really great plasma that looks incredibly super hot, go check out his tutorial. It's absolutely fantastic, and I'm just sort of not doing it justice. Well, there you have it. Another combat patrol in the books as we move towards our final one of the challenge. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was my genuine pleasure to make and share it with you. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, comment, and subscribe. Help drive us to the front page of YouTube and grow our audience. And of course, you can always join us over on Patreon. Now, joining our Patreon at any level grants you access to our private Discord server where like-minded hobbyists help each other out every day with honest and kind feedback. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.